Hello everyone and welcome back. So we are going to be continuing with the series. In the last video we did the data ingestion component. So we saw how we can read data from a particular source. So our source was data from a GitHub repo. So from there we were able to ingest the data into a model. So up to now our model is able to read data from a particular source. So you can watch the previous video. So if you haven't, from there you will learn. You will learn how to ingest data into your model. There are various ways you can ingest data into a model. Um, the most common ones I think will be ingesting data from, let's say, a database or a cloud database, something like that. So in the future videos we might consider trying to ingest data from a particular source, for example Amazon S3 buckets, or also we can also use the Amazon databases just to import data into a model. Another source of data can be, I think that's also a common one, Atlas. I think Atlas from MongoDB. You can also ingest data from that. So in the future videos, we might consider ingesting data from, so we'll be trying ingesting data from different databases or different sources. Okay, so at this point, before we continue, please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. We are welcoming you to this wonderful community. You can also hit that notification bell so that you never miss any of our video updates. With all that said, let's get started with the data validation. So before we get started, there were some things that I tried to modify, and one of them was that I didn't want to commit the artifacts. So the artifacts, the data, as well as other artifacts. So I won't be committing them to my GitHub repository. So to do that, the first thing that I did was I started by let me find it. Yeah, I used this git command to try to do away with the artifacts folder at the beginning. So as you can see, we are trying to remove these files from our GitHub repository. Then after that, we did a git commit to remove the folders from the repository. Okay, then as from GitHub repo, we remove this. Then we did a git push again. So when you go back to the GitHub repo, you cannot see the artifacts folder. So to ensure that the artifacts folder won't be committed, so when you can go to the git ignore file, and this is the artifacts folder. So you just artifacts, then the /. So this means that in any commits that you're going to be doing, henceforth, there's nothing from the artifacts folder that will be committed to the GitHub repository. So I'm trying to do this so that we try, most of the times you might be working with the data in large quantities, and it won't be good enough, I think, to push the heavy files to GitHub repository. It won't even allow you to do that. So GitHub repo is only about the code itself. So you can also do the same, so that you won't need to push those files to the GitHub repo. So that's what I wanted to inform you before we get started. So with all that said, let's go to the research folder again. And inside the research folder, we are going to create a new file. And this file, just name it part 2. And this part 2 is about data validation. So it's very important to validate your data because to make sure you have the correct schema. So in terms of schema, I just want to emphasize that I'm talking about the columns as well as the data types for those values. So it's very important to make sure that you're dealing with the correct schema in your model, okay? So we are going to do that data validation. So as usual, we are going to start by importing the necessary libraries for that. So again, from data classes, import data class. Then we're also going to import the path. So from pathlib, we are going to import from pathlib, import path. Also from src electricity bill, we are going to import constants. So these are just the similar things that we did in the data ingestion. So I can just lift them from here. So I think this create directories, get size, and logging. Yeah, you can just copy this into a data validation. Okay, so that's fine. Then we can also import OS. We have imported logging. So import pandas as PD. So we are going to create our data ingestion config. So defining the structure of the our data ingestion config. So we are going to define the structure of the data validation config using the data class. So data class data validation config. That's okay. Data validation config. So basically here you are going to define the paths, define the path for data validation config and all that. So as we saw earlier, whenever we are dealing with paths, we need to go to our config.yaml file, and inside this we need to specify the necessary paths that you're going to take. So here we are in the data validation. So data validation, then we are going to let's say the root directory. The root directory, that will be artifacts dash data validation. Then we are going to unzip. So unzip data directory. So unzip the data directory. So that will be artifacts. Then data ingestion. Then electricity bill dataset. So electricity bill dataset.csv. Then status file. So that will be artifacts. Be artifacts slash data artifacts data validation. Then we'll have a file, so status.txt. So this file, the status.txt, will contain the necessary information that will tell us if we are successful in doing the data validation. Okay, so root directory, unzip the data. So we are going to unzip this data from this path. Again, data electricity.csv. Zip data direct supposed to be artifacts. So I'm just confirming if everything is okay. So we can save this. Go back to our data validation. So the same paths or the same configuration, we're just going to repeat the same here. So define the class, define the class like this. I'm just going to do away with this first. Then we can call the root directory. So the root directory, so that's the path. Then the status file, just str as a string, then unzip the data directory, that's also a path. Then all schema, that's a dictionary, dict, yeah, dict. So we need to update our schema. So go to the schema. Under the schema, we need, now we can just do away with this. Under the schema, let me open the, so our data, just a minute, schema. So our data, this is our data. So the df.info, we can get the columns as well as the data type. So I'm just going to copy this entire information and go to our schema and just paste it here, and then remove the unnecessary things. So for example, just remain with the column names. Then we can do away with this. So the easiest way is just Control F2, then we can do a one-time delete. Then we can replace that with this. Then for the null again, we can again just Control F2 delete. Control F2, just do Control F2 and delete. So you can say columns, make sure to include the semicolon, then this one, you can do that. So once you save this, so this is the schema. Then you can also specify the target column. So target column is the electricity bill. So you can just again copy this. So target column, you can just use a name, target column electricity bill, then you can just do away this. So we have our target column. Then here we have the column names, fan, refrigerator, all the way till Twitter. Okay. We can just save this. I think this one is okay. I think this one is okay. We have now updated our schema. So from here, we can just do away with this. So we have the entire columns. We can say columns. These are the columns. So data validation. So all schema, we have updated that. So we then create a configuration manager class to, then we create a configuration manager class to manage the configurations. The configurations, so that's okay. So class config manager. So these are just the same things that we did earlier. So config manager def underscore init self this and this, that's okay. Then from here we need to initialize the configuration manager. Basically we'll be reading the YAML files. So self.config read YAML file config file path. YAML, the parameters, and also self.schema read the schema, so that's okay. Then create necessary directories. Create the directory self.config, so that's okay. So I'm getting an error. Params file path, params. Getting an error. This path is not defined. Config file path, params. Directory status, that's okay. I think it was an indentation issue. I think it was an indentation issue. So we can just, indentation. Okay, if we do like this, we think it was an indentation issue. Okay. Let me confirm something. I think it was indentation. Don't need this. So initialize the configuration manager, read the YAML configuration files to initialize the configuration parameters, then create directories for that. Okay. I think prefer them to be aligned is they should be aligned like this. This is better. So after this, we get the validation config object. So when you reach at this point, then these are just the normal things that get the data validation config object, config self, config dot data validation, then schema. Need to add the schema. So schema self dot schema self dot schema columns. Okay, self dot schema dot columns. Then after this, we create the data validation configuration object. But before that, we need to create directories for this. So create directories. So config.root directory. Config.root directory, that's okay. Then after this, create data validation config object. So data validation config, the root directory. So whatever we are passing in here is what we used in the data validation config. So just the same thing. Then after this, we need to return the data validation config, this one here. So as I showed you earlier, I'm using a tab 9. Then if you just need an explanation of this, you can just click explain, and tab 9 is just working like similar to Git collab. I think it's collab. So it's just the same thing. So under this, as you can see, the selected code within the configuration manager class is responsible for creating and returning a data validation config object. This object encapsulates the configuration parameters required for the data validation. So this code snippet demonstrates how the configuration manager class manages this and this and this. So you can just read through and try to get an understanding of what is happening here. So after that, then we need to create now the class that is actually conducting the data validation. So class data validation. So class data validation, def init, that's def init. So this one you can self config a data validation configuration, that's okay. And I can just do away with this. Dev init self config. Then self dot config. So that's it. Then we create another function method to validate all columns of the data set against the specified schema. So if validates columns self, then we need to return something like a boolean. And just return a boolean value, either true or false. So inside here, I'm going to use a try block. So for the try validation status none. Then okay, so data pd dot read underscore csv. So we are reading that from the unzipped directory. So config dot unzip data directory. Then columns. So you're going to list data dot. So the data, you're going to list the columns in the data. Then all schema and say self dot config dot all schema dot is and actually you can just use a for loop. So for calls in all columns, if column is in all schema, validation status to be false. Then logging error column is not present in all schema. You can add something here. Let's see. So return validation status exception.e raise e. For columns in all columns, if column not in all schema, validation status false, login error. We are going to log in this. Else validation is true, login is present in all schema. Okay. So this is about validation or if we have all the columns. So we are going to create another method. So method to validate the data types of all columns. So def validates data types, that's okay. Try validation status none. Data, that's okay. All columns list, so just the same thing. All schema, so read the CSV file. Try validation status, that's okay. So here we read the CSV file. Then after reading that, we need to get all columns and their corresponding data types. Get all columns and their corresponding data types from the schema. So remember we prepared that schema. Then after that, we need to check if. Then after this, we need to check if the data types of the columns in the dataset match those specified in the schema. Then simpler, we're just going to use something like a for loop. Else validation to schema. There's something we need to write this information to false, else true. There's something we're missing. If column not in all columns validation status false, then we're going to log into error this. Then we need to write some. We have the txt file, so we need to write validation status to the status file, either true or false. So with open self config status file, save the config status files as f write s f write validation status. Then we don't need this one again. Else validation true. Then again, if the validation is true, again we need to write I think that's okay. Then we return the validation status exception as raise e. So that's it. So for this again, need to end validation data types. So again, we need to write again we need to write that. And with open validation status, then we need to return the validation status. So validation status exception as raise e. I think we are having another indentation again. These challenges of indentation again, we need to do like this. So we are in the same indentation def, okay, whether to validate, then else validation is true, okay, validation as e. Then after we are done with this, we go to our main pipeline. So the pipeline, if name equal sign, then main, underscore main underscore. Then we can say try block, just say pass at the start. Then we can say accept exception as e. Then we can say accept exception as e. Then here we can just raise e. So we start defining our pipeline. So the first one is about initialize. You're going to first initialize configuration manager. Initialize the configuration manager to get the config settings. Accept. Okay, so and say and this is just a config. Just use configuration manager, data validation config. Then we can just use config, get data validation config. So we initialize the configuration manager, get the configuration settings. Then after that, we get the data validation configuration, data validation config, data validation configuration, this one here. Then after we are done with that, the next step is about the data validation. So data validation config. Then we validate the columns of the data set against the specified schema. Validate the columns. Then we validate the data types of the columns again with the specified schema. Then after that, we can use a logging message to tell us that the data validation was complete. Then if you have an error, we can raise the exception here. So I'm going to save this. Hopefully everything is okay. So I'm going to execute this file. So I'm going to execute this. So control save. So let me terminal, new terminal. Then I'm going to execute this. So with this, I'm going to say Python. Then data validation, you can just copy the relative path. Then when you paste at the terminal, then press enter. So with this, we are going to get another folder under artifacts, and it will tell us either true or false if we have the correct schema. Okay, so if we are going to get the correct schema, I think we are going to get a yes. I think data type column auto pump, the schema matches the schema, data validation complete. So now, as you can see, everything is okay. So you can go to the data validation status.txt, you can see true. That means that we have successfully validated our data, and we have ensured that all the columns are existing, same as the data type as well as the column names. Okay, so this is all about the data validation. So as you can see, it's just a simple task. Okay, so data validation to be true. So you can now clap for your hands, clap for yourself. So this is okay. So after this, we can then push this to the Git repo. So git add. So git add dot, then git status. So let me see if we are going to commit. So as you can see, we are only going to we modified the config.yaml. The new file that we created is this, and we also modified the schema.yaml file. So I think that is okay. I think let me complete until the main.py. Then from there we can do the commit. So let me unstake this. I think it's git restore. If I'm not git restore, it's supposed to be git. I usually confuse between git restore and so git restore versus, I think it's git reset. Git reset. You need to reset the unstaging. Okay, so git reset and stage changes after the reset schema.yaml config.yaml. This one and this one. Okay, no problem. So let me, you can see everything is running okay, and even if you go to the logs, you can see that also getting the same information about that. So let me convert this to the modular coding. Then after that, we can then do the committing. Okay. So actually it follows so the config, we already did the config. We also did the schema for the parameters until we get to the model trainer. Yeah, that's when we modify the parameters. At the moment, let it just be like this. So the next thing is about entity. So we go to our entity configuration entity. So we need to copy the entity. So entity, configuration entity. So this is the entity, so data class and all this information. So we're going to copy this, going to configuration entity, then we create, so this one is a data validation entity. So here we can data class validation entity, define the path to the data validation configure. We can just do away with this, don't need it. So data validation entity, so data class, data validation entity, data ingestion, data validation. So that's the entity. So entity, configuration entity. So once we are done, we can just do away with it. Then configuration manager in the SRC folder. So SRC folder, we do have the data validation the configuration manager. So the configure, this one. So we need to update the configuration manager here. So for the config, again, go back to data validation. This is the configuration manager. So just going to copy all this. No, this one is already there. So we are just going to copy, I think it is this one. We're only going to copy this. So we already have the configuration manager and data ingestion config. We already have data ingestion config, data ingestion config. So we only need to copy the data validation config and import the data validation. So entity, then now you can say data. Can just copy this, copy and paste it here. So data validation config. Yeah, so we have imported the modules for that. So we can save this. Data ingestion config, data validation config. So that's okay. So data validation, no, configuration. So configuration, that's okay. So after the config, we go to the component. Okay. So in the component, that is the data validation component, data ingestion. So data validation component. So this is the data validation component. So we copy this class. So the entirety of this class. So data validation component, data validation component. Then there are some things like the logging, data config that we need. So say import OS, we need the logger. So from src dot electricity bill import logging, we need the logging. Logging. Then you can see we need pandas, the pandas library. So from pandas import from so import pandas as pd, then data validation config. So data validation config, then so from src dot electricity bill config, so that is in the entity entity config entity configuration entity. We're going to import data validation config, any other thing that we are missing? Anything? We are not missing anything, so that's okay. So that's the component part. So component part is actually the enforcer of the instructions. So here we're just creating methods or functions that carry out the necessary D type. the necessary instructions. Okay. After the components, we then go to the pipeline. So component we are done, config we are done. We go to the pipelines. So pipelines, we go to data ingestion. I think it's this one. But first, let me rename it. I'm just going to say this is pipeline number 2, data validation. So this is what we are done with. Data validation component, I don't need it. So data validation pipeline. So pipeline, for this pipeline, we can say we're going to import the necessary modules for that. Just copy this data validation pipeline. So here we need the configuration manager. Instead of data ingestion component, we need data validation. So C02 data validation. We don't need data ingestion, we need data validation. Our logging is the same. So we can call this pipeline number 2. We can just call this and copy this data validation. So the first name is the data validation. So this is the data validation pipeline. So class data ingestion, so we can just change this to validation. A data validation pipeline, def init.path. So def main self, so configuration manager, a data validation config get. So this one can just copy this. I think up to here. So configuration manager, data validation config. Maybe you can just do away with this. Don't need this. Don't need this. But this is instructions. You can get it from the when we're doing the experimentation, the research. So data config data get, okay, config validate all columns, validate data types. So if underscore main, try logging info pipeline object data validation pipeline, this one here. Then pipeline main logging info. Okay. We can add a little bit of stars here. So terminated successfully, pipeline terminated. So data validation pipeline terminated, started, terminated. Then exception.py, that's okay. So after this schema, we already updated our schema. Config.yaml, we already updated our config.yaml, so you can just do away with this. Data validation, I think we have done with it. So we need to go to our main.py. So main.py, and then we need to, I can just copy this because we are almost repeating the same thing. So component, that is should be data validation component. So component name data validation component, this one remains. So login info, so pipeline data, this one validation pipeline.main object.info info. So we need to import this one. So src so until here it will be the same. Pip2 data validation, import data validation pipeline. So this one is this, and that's it. Component name, so So okay, I think everything is okay. Let's try to execute from the main.py. So python main.py. We need to get the almost similar results as what we did here. Yeah, so I think this is the data ingestion component. So this is the data validation component. As you can see, we have, when you start getting such things, then your code is working okay. So we have successfully converted our code into the modular coding. So then after this, now we can do the git push. So just do cls. So git add dot git status. Git status, you can see the files that we modified and the files that we added. Then after the git status, we need to git commit. So git commit minus m. Here we can say data validation complete. Data validation complete. Git commit minus m. Do not match. Git commit minus m. Data validation complete. I supposed to be hyphen m without a space. Then git push. Git push minus u origin main. Yeah, so let's check that. So data validation. So let's see. Can check under the SRC folder. You can see we have the data validation. Data validation. You can see data validation under pipelines, commons, data validation. Yeah, so everything is okay. Everything is okay. Now, so that was all about the data validation. So this section, we were able to do the data validation where we were validating the schema. The schema is nothing but just the column names and their respective data types. Okay, so we're just confirming that if we are going to we need the config. So we are just saying that we are creating a root directory that will store the necessary files. And under the files, we are going to get we are going to source for this folder the electricity bills data set under the data ingestion. This one. So after we get this, we are going to check if we have the said number of columns using this method, and we also have the said number of data types of the same data types as defined in the schema. Okay, so after that, using those methods, we are able to execute that, and we found that yes, indeed, our file contains those things. So it was validated. So the next step, then from here, then move to the next step, which is about data transformation. So we are going to do that in the next step. So that's all for this session. Once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for finding time to watch this video. I'm very motivated by you taking time to watch this and maybe say something about them. So I'm going to stop at this point. Then I'll continue the session in the next one where we will be doing data transformation. Once again, thank you for your time. Please remember to subscribe, share it with your friends, like, and also leave a comment behind if you have something. Then we'll try to get back to you. So until next time, see you.